A peaceful evening turns into a nightmare when a young black boy, Jeremiah, is tragically shot by a racially biased police officer. What should have been a simple basketball game ends in heartbreak, igniting outrage across the community. As the devastating truth comes to light, a grieving family is thrust into a battle against systemic injustice. Their pursuit of accountability uncovers deep-rooted prejudice, pushing them to fight for change against overwhelming odds. This is a story of loss, resilience, and the relentless search for justice. Will their efforts bring reform or deepen the pain of their tragedy? Subscribe and like our channel to follow this unforgettable journey. The patrol car arrives, its headlights slicing through the darkened streets of the gated community. Officer Bradley Porter steps out, scanning the area as the faint sound of a bouncing basketball draws his attention. His hand instinctively rests on the holster of his firearm as he cautiously approaches. Jeremiah Wright, 13, retrieves his ball from a manicured lawn just beyond the gated court, unaware of the approaching officer. As Bradley's sharp voice cuts through the silence, Jeremiah freezes mid-dribble and turns to face him. Bradley's face hardens as he takes in Jeremiah's hoodie and hesitance. Misinterpreting the boy's nervousness as defiance, he steps closer and commands Jeremiah to step back and raise his hands. Jeremiah stammers an explanation, lifting the ball to show why he's there, but his trembling voice and uncertain movements only fuel Bradley's suspicion. The tension escalates when Bradley's radio crackles to life, momentarily distracting him. Jeremiah, gripped by fear, instinctively turns and bolts toward the basketball court. Bradley's voice rises as he shouts for the boy to stop. His pulse quickens as adrenaline takes over, and in a split second, he draws his weapon. The loud crack of a gunshot splits the air. Jeremiah stumbles and collapses onto the pavement, his basketball rolling away into the shadows. Porch lights flicker on as the quiet neighborhood awakens to the commotion. Faces peer cautiously from windows, and the distant wail of sirens grows louder. Bradley stands frozen, his gun still raised, the weight of his actions sinking in. His breathing is shallow, his hands trembling. The words, "It was a warning shot," escape his lips in a whisper, but the sight of Jeremiah's lifeless body tells a different story. Moments later, an ambulance pulls up, and paramedics rush to the scene. The flashing red and blue lights illuminate Marcus and Helena right as they arrive, pushing through the police tape. Helena's anguished scream pierces the air as she collapses at the sight of her son. Marcus, his expression a mix of disbelief and fury, kneels beside Jeremiah. His trembling hands hover over his son's lifeless form, unable to touch him as tears stream down his face. Bradley watches from a distance, unable to move. Marcus's gaze locks onto him, filled with an unspoken promise of justice. The sirens wail louder as the chaotic scene unfolds, setting the stage for a confrontation that will shake the community to its core. The ambulance carrying Jeremiah's lifeless body sped away into the night, its sirens piercing through the air. Helena collapsed to her knees at the edge of the scene, clutching at the earth beneath her as though she could pull herself out of this nightmare. Marcus stood beside her, frozen in place. The flashing lights of police cars danced across his face, but he didn't blink. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. Words failed him, the world around him felt muted, as if it had moved into slow motion. Helena's sobs broke through the numbness. Her cries for Jeremiah echoed in the night, raw and unrelenting. She staggered to her feet, her grief twisting into anger as she moved toward Bradley. Officers instinctively stepped between her and the man who had fired the shot. She demanded answers, her piercing gaze cutting through Bradley's weak posture. His trembling hands and averted eyes offered none. Marcus pulled Helena back, his arms firm around her trembling frame. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed into him, the weight of her sorrow consuming her. But Marcus's eyes never left Bradley. His expression shifted from anguish to a cold, unyielding resolve. He knew this wasn't the time for confrontation, but a promise formed silently in his mind: this would not end here. At the Wright household, Maya sat on the living room couch, her knees pulled to her chest. The television displayed images of flashing lights and police tape, muted but ever present. She glanced repeatedly at her phone, her fingers twitching as though she wanted to call her parents but couldn't bring herself to do it. A family friend, Mrs. Harris, sat beside her, holding her hand and offering quiet words of comfort. Maya barely registered her presence. When Helena and Marcus finally arrived home, the atmosphere grew even heavier. Helena looked like a ghost of herself, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. Maya leapt from the couch, rushing toward them with questions about Jeremiah. Marcus's voice cracked as he explained what had happened. The weight of the truth hit Maya like a tidal wave, and she stumbled backward, refusing to accept it. She collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs, while Helena knelt beside her, pulling her into an embrace. Marcus retreated to his study, closing the door behind him. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with his unspoken grief. He stood by his desk, staring at a photograph of Jeremiah. In the picture, Jeremiah was holding a basketball, his face lit with a bright, carefree smile. Marcus picked up the frame, his hands trembling. Setting it down carefully, he opened his laptop and began typing. His words were sharp and deliberate, directed at a colleague who could help him take the first step toward justice. His thoughts were no longer consumed by sorrow alone, they were now fueled by purpose. The next morning, the Wright household was eerily quiet. Every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. Maya sat at the kitchen table, staring at a plate of untouched food. Helena moved aimlessly around the kitchen, cleaning dishes that didn't need to be cleaned. When Marcus entered, dressed in a suit, the tension in the room sharpened. Without looking up, he explained that he was going to the precinct to obtain the incident report. Helena's anxiety was palpable, but she didn't stop him. Instead, she placed a hand on his chest and whispered a plea for him to be careful. He nodded, his resolve unshaken, and left the house. At the precinct, Marcus faced a wall of resistance. Officers avoided his gaze, deflecting his questions with bureaucratic excuses. He demanded to see the report, his voice steady but laced with fury. A lieutenant finally intervened, attempting to de-escalate the situation. Marcus's frustration grew as he realized the system was already working to shield itself. He left the precinct empty-handed but more determined than ever. Back home, Helena received a visit from Reverend James, a family friend and community leader. He sat with her and Maya, offering words of comfort and prayer. Helena listened silently, clutching a framed photo of Jeremiah, while Maya's anger simmered just below the surface. She struggled to contain her frustration as Reverend James spoke of healing and patience. The weight of her loss demanded action, not platitudes. As the day progressed, news of Jeremiah's death spread. Reporters camped outside the Wright home, their cameras trained on the front door. Helena peeked through the curtains, her anxiety mounting with every passing hour. When Marcus returned, his expression grim, he gathered his family in the living room. The media would twist the narrative if they didn't act quickly, he explained. They needed to control the story and ensure that Jeremiah's name was remembered for who he truly was. The family's grief began to shift into determination. Helena, still clutching her photo of Jeremiah, placed her hand over Marcus's. Together, they resolved to fight for their son's memory and for justice. Maya, her voice steady despite her tears, joined them. The family, united in their pain, prepared to take the first steps on a long and arduous journey toward accountability. The precinct buzzed with activity as officers shuffled papers, fielded phone calls, and moved through the narrow hallways. Marcus Wright entered the building with an air of determination, his presence commanding attention. His polished suit and piercing gaze contrasted sharply with the chaos around him. He approached the front desk, his tone sharp as he demanded to speak to the officer in charge of his son's case. The clerk hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, before gesturing toward a conference room down the hall. Inside the room, Lieutenant Harper sat at a table cluttered with files. Her face was stern but weary, a veteran of too many tragic cases. Marcus entered with purposeful steps, ignoring the pleasantries Harper extended. Instead, he leaned forward over the table, his hands pressing flat against its surface, his unspoken demand for answers filling the room. Harper opened a file and slid a preliminary incident report toward Marcus. The document was sparse, filled with vague descriptions and generic phrases that revealed little. As Marcus scanned the report, his expression hardened. Every line read like an excuse, a carefully crafted shield designed to obscure the truth. Frustrated, Marcus pushed the report back toward Harper and asked to see the body cam footage. Harper hesitated before moving to a monitor in the corner of the room. The grainy video that played showed Officer Bradley Porter approaching Jeremiah with his weapon already drawn. The audio crackled with harsh commands, followed by Jeremiah's trembling attempts to explain himself. When Jeremiah turned to run, the screen froze as the sound of the gunshot echoed through the room. Marcus's hands curled into fists, the tension in his jaw visible. The weight of the footage left Marcus in silence. He didn't need to voice the questions already burning in his mind. Why had Porter drawn his weapon on a child? Why had Jeremiah's innocence been met with such aggression? Harper avoided his gaze, her unease palpable. Outside the precinct, a growing crowd of protesters had gathered. Signs demanding justice and condemning the violence filled the air, accompanied by chants that carried through the streets. Reporters mingled among the protesters, their cameras capturing every moment. Marcus exited the precinct, his expression unreadable, ignoring the flurry of questions shouted in his direction. At home, Helena and Maya watched the news with heavy hearts. The coverage shifted between clips of the protest and heated debates among commentators. Helena's eyes remained fixed on the screen, while Maya's frustration grew. The words of the commentators, questioning Jeremiah's actions and painting him in a suspicious light, stoked her anger. She couldn't bear to see her brother's memory tarnished by strangers who didn't know him. As the night deepened, Marcus received an anonymous tip through email. The message was brief but impactful, suggesting he review security footage from a house near the basketball court. The map attachment highlighted the specific location. Marcus's heart raced as he realized this could be the breakthrough he needed. The next morning, Marcus stood at the door of the highlighted house. A middle-aged man answered, his cautious demeanor evident. Marcus explained the purpose of his visit, his voice steady but insistent. The man hesitated but eventually led Marcus to a monitor displaying feeds from several security cameras. He explained that he had already shared what he had with the police, but Marcus's determined plea convinced him to show the footage again. The security footage provided a clearer view of the moments leading up to the shooting. Jeremiah was seen retrieving his basketball and beginning to walk away, his hands visibly empty except for the ball. Porter's arrival was swift and aggressive, his weapon drawn immediately. Jeremiah's decision to run came only after Porter's escalating commands and intimidating posture. The shot was fired as Jeremiah turned, sealing the tragedy in indisputable detail. Marcus's breath hitched as he watched the scene unfold. This footage told a story that the official report had carefully avoided. He asked the homeowner for a copy, and after some hesitation, the man agreed. Marcus left with the footage, his resolve hardening with every step he took. Back at the precinct, Marcus confronted Lieutenant Harper with the new evidence. The flash drive he handed over contained the unedited truth, a stark contrast to the sanitized narrative in the initial report. Harper's reaction was a mixture of shock and concern as she reviewed the footage. She called in her team, but Marcus's patience had worn thin. He was no longer content to wait for a system that had already failed his son. That evening, Marcus held a press conference. He stood before a crowd of reporters, his voice steady but charged with emotion as he introduced the security footage. The video played on a screen behind him, its clarity leaving no room for doubt. Gasps rippled through the audience as they witnessed Jeremiah's final moments, the stark injustice of his death laid bare. The public's outrage intensified, and the calls for accountability grew louder. The revelations triggered a series of actions. The police department placed Porter on administrative leave, and an internal review was launched. Protesters outside the precinct celebrated the small victory, but Marcus remained focused. He knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. As the investigation deepened, more troubling details emerged. Internal records revealed a history of complaints against Porter, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. Despite the consistent pattern, none of these complaints had resulted in meaningful consequences. The systemic failure was undeniable, and Marcus vowed to expose it. Meanwhile, Helena and Maya worked tirelessly to ensure Jeremiah's humanity wasn't lost amid the chaos. They shared personal stories about his kindness, his love for basketball, and his dreams of becoming an engineer. These efforts resonated with the public, shifting the narrative and reminding people that Jeremiah was more than a victim. He was a bright, promising young man whose life had been senselessly taken. The tipping point came when another anonymous tip revealed evidence of tampered body cam footage. Marcus's legal team filed for access to the unaltered files, uncovering crucial segments that had been omitted. The unedited footage showed Porter's escalating aggression and his complete disregard for protocol. It was the final piece needed to solidify the case. During a public hearing, Marcus presented the culmination of his efforts. He stood before officials and community members, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The room was silent as he spoke, his words cutting through the air like a blade. By the time he finished, the weight of the truth was undeniable. The crowd erupted into applause, their support a testament to the power of persistence. Despite the progress, Marcus remained somber. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, there was hope. The truth had come to light, and the path forward was clearer than ever. The courtroom buzzed with quiet intensity as people shuffled into their seats. Every bench was filled, with an overflow of spectators standing at the back. Journalists lined the aisles, their pens poised and cameras trained, ready to capture the beginning of what had become one of the most controversial trials in the city's history. At the center of it all sat Marcus Wright and his family, their grief palpable as they prepared to face the man responsible for Jeremiah's death. The judge entered the room, and a heavy silence settled over the crowd. Officer Bradley Porter sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and strained. He avoided looking at the Wright family, his hands fidgeting in his lap. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Porter's gaze remained fixed on the table. The prosecution began their opening statement. The lead attorney, a woman with a commanding presence named Sarah Green, laid out the case with precision. She painted a vivid picture of Jeremiah's last moments, describing how he had been pursued and killed despite posing no threat. She detailed the systemic failures that had enabled Porter's actions and vowed to bring justice to the Wright family. The courtroom hung on her every word, the weight of her argument undeniable. When it was the defense's turn, they took a markedly different approach. Porter's lawyer attempted to humanize his client, portraying him as a dedicated officer who had made a tragic mistake in a high-pressure situation. He argued that Porter's actions, while regrettable, were not criminal. The defense's narrative was carefully crafted to evoke sympathy, but the tension in the room suggested that their argument had not landed as they had hoped. The first day of testimony began with witnesses recounting the events leading up to the shooting. Neighbors who had seen Jeremiah playing basketball described him as a kind and respectful boy. One elderly woman, visibly shaken, recounted how she had called the police that night, believing Jeremiah to be a trespasser. Her voice wavered as she admitted that her assumptions had been rooted in prejudice, a confession that left the courtroom stunned. The prosecution's case grew stronger with each witness. Security footage from a nearby house was played, showing Jeremiah retrieving his basketball and beginning to walk away. The unaltered body cam footage was also presented, revealing Porter's escalating aggression and disregard for protocol. The images and audio were damning, leaving little room for doubt about the chain of events. The Wright family watched in silence as the evidence unfolded. Helena clutched a tissue in her hand, her knuckles white as she fought to hold back tears. Maya's gaze was fixed on the screen, her anger barely concealed. Marcus remained stoic, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his posture betrayed his inner turmoil. When Porter took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. All eyes were on him as he recounted the events of that night. His voice was shaky, his demeanor subdued. He described his actions as a split-second decision, claiming he had feared for his life. But under cross-examination, Sarah Green dismantled his narrative. She pointed out inconsistencies in his account and highlighted his history of complaints, painting a picture of a man unfit to serve as an officer. As the trial continued, the defense attempted to shift blame onto the system, arguing that Porter had been poorly trained and placed in an untenable position. While some jurors appeared to consider this argument, the prosecution countered with expert testimony that exposed the systemic biases within the police force. A renowned criminologist detailed patterns of excessive force and racial profiling, using data to demonstrate that Jeremiah's death was not an isolated incident but part of a broader issue. The most emotionally charged moment of the trial came when Marcus took the stand. He spoke about Jeremiah's dreams and the light he brought to their family. His voice cracked as he described finding his son's lifeless body on the basketball court. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional muffled sob from the audience. Even some jurors appeared visibly moved, their faces reflecting the weight of Marcus's testimony. Outside the courthouse, tensions were boiling over. Protests and counter-protests had grown increasingly volatile, with clashes between demonstrators and police becoming a nightly occurrence. The media coverage was relentless, and public opinion was sharply divided. For the Wright family, the world outside the courtroom felt like an extension of the battlefield within it. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides prepared their closing arguments. Sarah Green stood before the jury, her presence commanding. She spoke of accountability, of the need to ensure that Jeremiah's death was not in vain. She reminded them of the evidence, the footage, the testimonies, and the undeniable truth that Jeremiah had been an innocent child robbed of his future. The defense's closing argument leaned heavily on the narrative of a tragic mistake. They urged the jury to consider the pressures faced by law enforcement and to view Porter as a flawed human being rather than a villain. While their plea was heartfelt, it struggled to counter the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse palpable as everyone awaited their decision. When the verdict was finally announced, the room was silent. The foreperson stood and declared Officer Bradley Porter guilty of manslaughter. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Helena broke down in tears, her sobs mingling with the murmurs of the crowd. Marcus closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek as he exhaled deeply. Maya gripped her father's hand tightly, her expression a mix of relief and lingering sorrow. Porter's sentencing was set for a later date, but the conviction marked a significant victory for the Wright family and their supporters. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers, their chants of justice for Jeremiah echoing through the streets. The Wright family stepped out to face the cameras, their grief still fresh but their resolve stronger than ever. Marcus spoke briefly, his voice steady as he called for continued action to address the systemic issues that had led to his son's death. The trial's conclusion was not the end of the Wright family's journey. It was a milestone, a step toward justice, but the fight for systemic change was far from over. The world had seen the truth, and the Wrights were determined to ensure that Jeremiah's legacy would be one of transformation and hope. The morning of the verdict arrived with a heavy air of anticipation. The courthouse was surrounded by a sea of people, their voices a mixture of chants for justice and defiant cries of support for the accused. Tensions ran high, with barricades separating opposing groups of protesters and police officers standing watch, their expressions unreadable. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled, and the atmosphere was electric. The Wright family sat together in the front row, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Helena gripped Marcus's hand tightly, while Maya stared straight ahead, her jaw set with determination. Marcus sat stoically, his emotions tightly controlled, though his eyes betrayed the storm brewing within him. Across the aisle, Bradley Porter sat at the defendant's table. His lawyer leaned in, whispering words of reassurance, but Porter looked pale and defeated. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for the weight of the judgment about to come. The jury filed into the courtroom, their expressions guarded. The foreperson held a folded piece of paper in their hand, and every eye in the room followed its path as it was handed to the judge. The judge, a composed figure of authority, unfolded the paper and read it silently before raising her gaze to address the room. The tension was unbearable. Helena's breath hitched, and Maya leaned forward slightly, her fingers digging into the armrest of her chair. Marcus remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the judge as if willing her to speak. When the judge announced the guilty verdict, the courtroom erupted. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, and the sound of Helena's sobs broke through the noise. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she reached for her mother, while Marcus closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek as he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The judge called for order, her gavel striking the wood sharply. Slowly, the room quieted, though the energy remained charged. Porter's head dropped, and his lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but there was no comfort to be found. The prosecution team exchanged brief nods, their satisfaction tempered by the somber reality of the case. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. The chants of justice for Jeremiah grew louder, and the crowd surged with emotion. Reporters scrambled to relay the verdict, their voices competing with the roar of the protesters. Some celebrated, while others denounced the outcome as unjust. The city seemed to pulse with the energy of the moment, its collective heart beating in time with the Wright family's victory. The Wrights exited the courthouse to a barrage of cameras and microphones. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. He spoke of Jeremiah's light, the senseless loss of his life, and the importance of holding those in power accountable. He called for continued action, reminding everyone that the verdict was only the beginning of the fight for systemic change. His words were met with applause and renewed chants, the crowd's energy unwavering. As the family returned home that evening, the weight of the day began to settle in. Helena sat quietly in the living room, holding one of Jeremiah's basketball jerseys close to her chest. Maya joined her, sitting on the floor and leaning her head against her mother's knee. The two found solace in their shared grief, their bond strengthened by the day's events. Marcus retreated to his study, where he stared at a framed photo of Jeremiah on his desk. His mind raced with thoughts of what had been achieved and what still lay ahead. The fight for justice had brought them this far, but he knew the work was far from over. The system that had allowed this tragedy to happen still needed to be dismantled, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Bradley Porter sat in a holding cell, his world unraveling around him. The walls felt closer with every passing moment, the reality of his conviction sinking in. He thought about the trial, the evidence, and the faces of the Wright family. Guilt pressed down on him like a weight he could never shed. For the first time, he began to question not only his actions but the system that had shaped him. The next day, the city continued to grapple with the verdict. Protests persisted, some celebratory, others angry. The media's coverage was relentless, dissecting every angle of the case and its implications. Discussions of police reform and accountability dominated headlines, and public officials were pressured to take action. Marcus was invited to speak at a town hall meeting that evening. The room was packed, with standing room only as community members gathered to hear his words. He spoke with conviction, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of his passion. He called for concrete changes, from mandatory body cameras to independent investigations of police misconduct. The crowd responded with thunderous applause, their resolve matching his own. Helena and Maya watched from the front row, their presence a silent testament to the strength of their family. For them, the fight was personal, but they could see how it had become something larger. Jeremiah's story had touched countless lives, and his legacy was growing into a movement that demanded justice for all. In the weeks that followed, the Wright family's lives remained a whirlwind of activity. They attended rallies, met with lawmakers, and worked tirelessly to keep Jeremiah's memory alive. Each step forward felt like a small victory, but the void left by Jeremiah's absence was always there, a reminder of the cost of their fight. One evening, Marcus sat in the living room with Helena and Maya. The house was quiet, the chaos of the day finally giving way to a rare moment of peace. Marcus looked at his family, his heart heavy but full of pride. They had endured so much, but they had done it together. He knew their journey was far from over, but in that moment, he allowed himself to feel hope. Jeremiah's framed photo sat on the mantel, illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby lamp. His smile seemed to light up the room, a reminder of why they fought and who they fought for. The Wright family's battle for justice had begun with unimaginable pain, but it had grown into something powerful, something that could change the world. And though the road ahead was long, they were ready to walk it, hand in hand, carrying Jeremiah's memory with them every step of the way. The Wright family's victory in court sent ripples through the city and beyond, but Marcus knew the verdict was just the first step. Jeremiah's name had become a rallying cry for justice, but the system that allowed his death to happen remained intact. For the Wrights, this was the beginning of a larger battle, one that would challenge deeply ingrained structures and demand accountability from those in power. Marcus sat at his desk late into the night, drafting a letter to city officials. The room was dimly lit, the glow from his laptop casting shadows on the walls. He outlined proposals for reforms, mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent investigations of police misconduct, and training programs to address implicit bias. His words were precise, each sentence crafted with purpose. As he typed, Helena appeared in the doorway, her expression soft but resolute. She joined him at the desk, reviewing his work and offering her support. Together, they refined the document, determined to make their message impossible to ignore. The next morning, Marcus and Helena attended a community meeting at a local church. The room was packed, with people spilling out into the hallway. Community leaders, activists, and residents gathered to discuss the path forward. The air was thick with a mix of anger and hope, the energy palpable as voices rose in passionate debate. Marcus stood to address the crowd, his voice steady but charged with emotion. He spoke of Jeremiah's life, of the pain his family had endured, and of the urgent need for change. His words resonated, sparking applause and calls for action. By the end of the meeting, a coalition had formed, united by a shared determination to demand justice. The movement grew rapidly. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForJeremiah and #ReformNow. Protests swelled, drawing thousands of participants. Marches filled the streets, their chants echoing through the city. The Wright family became the face of the movement, their story a powerful reminder of the human cost of injustice. Helena and Maya spoke at rallies, their voices carrying the weight of their grief and the strength of their resolve. Marcus worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meeting with lawmakers, organizing events, and strategizing with activists. One evening, Marcus received an unexpected call from a state senator. The senator expressed interest in sponsoring legislation inspired by the movement's demands. Marcus's heart raced as he listened, the possibility of tangible change suddenly within reach. The senator invited him to testify at a legislative hearing, an opportunity to present the reforms directly to those with the power to enact them. Marcus accepted without hesitation, knowing this was a chance he couldn't afford to miss. The hearing was held in the state capitol, a grand building that loomed large with history and significance. Marcus arrived with Helena and Maya by his side, their presence a source of strength. The room was packed with legislators, activists, and reporters. As Marcus stepped to the podium, the weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he refused to falter. He spoke with conviction, presenting data, recounting stories, and making an impassioned plea for change. He ended his testimony by holding up Jeremiah's basketball jersey, a poignant reminder of the life that had been lost. The room fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. The legislative process was slow and fraught with challenges. Opponents of the reforms argued fiercely, raising concerns about costs and feasibility. Police unions pushed back, claiming the measures would hinder their ability to perform their duties. The Wright family faced personal attacks, their motives questioned by those who sought to maintain the status quo. But the movement's momentum was unstoppable. Activists organized phone banks, rallies, and letter-writing campaigns to pressure lawmakers. Each step forward felt hard-won, but the progress was undeniable. Meanwhile, Helena and Maya focused on building community support. They worked with local organizations to host workshops, town halls, and educational events. Maya, despite her youth, became a powerful speaker, her words inspiring a new generation of activists. At one event, she addressed a crowd of young people, encouraging them to use their voices and their votes to demand change. Her passion was infectious, and the audience erupted in cheers, their energy reinvigorating the movement. As the months passed, the Wright family's efforts began to bear fruit. Several cities implemented reforms modeled after their proposals, and the state legislature scheduled a vote on a comprehensive police accountability bill. On the day of the vote, the Wright family and their supporters gathered outside the Capitol, their chants of justice for Jeremiah ringing out as lawmakers debated inside. The vote was tense, with arguments on both sides reaching a fever pitch. Marcus and Helena sat in the gallery, their hands tightly clasped as they waited for the outcome. When the final tally was announced, cheers erupted. The bill had passed. Helena wept with relief, while Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of their journey momentarily lifting. Maya embraced them both, her smile a beacon of hope. The passage of the bill was a historic victory, but Marcus knew the fight was far from over. The reforms were a foundation, not a finish line. The Wright family continued their work, pushing for implementation and holding officials accountable. They partnered with national organizations, sharing their story and advocating for change on a broader scale. Jeremiah's legacy grew, his name becoming synonymous with the fight for justice. One evening, The Wrights hosted a community celebration at the basketball court where Jeremiah had spent so many hours. The court had been renamed in his honor, a mural of his smiling face painted on the wall. The event was filled with laughter, music, and speeches, a testament to the resilience of the community and the strength of the movement. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the court, Marcus stood with Helena and Maya, their hands intertwined. They looked out at the crowd, their hearts full of gratitude and determination. They had turned their pain into purpose, transforming tragedy into a movement that would continue to inspire change for generations to come. The Wright family stood together at the edge of the basketball court, now renamed Jeremiah Wright Memorial Court. The mural of Jeremiah, vibrant and full of life, stretched across the wall, illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. The court buzzed with activity. Children played basketball, their laughter echoing in the warm evening air, while families gathered around tables filled with food and drinks. It was a celebration of life, resilience, and the power of community. Marcus watched the scene with quiet pride. This court had been Jeremiah's sanctuary, the place where he had dreamed of his future. Now, it was a place of hope, a reminder of the change that had been born out of unimaginable tragedy. Helena stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes glistening as she watched Maya address the crowd. Maya stood on a makeshift stage, her voice strong and confident. She spoke of her brother's love for basketball, his kind heart, and the dreams he had shared with their family. She thanked the community for their support and urged them to continue fighting for justice and equality. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to her words.